Hello and welcome to the GeoCurrents series on global demography. This is lecture 10 in the series, and it will look at population patterns and processes in China and Japan from 1700 to around 1875. So I'll first talk about Japan, which is a very instructive counterexample to European countries, for example, or to really any other place in the world, because Japan had a unique historical trajectory, very rapid population growth in the 17th century, and then a real sharp decline in fertility, basically to the replacement level throughout the 18th century. And then after about 1850, a significant increase in the fertility rate, and then eventually another decrease. So it's important to look at some of the factors why that happened. Before going into the details, I want to talk a little bit about the physical geography of Japan. I have a map of Japan there and some information comparing it to California. So you can see in size, California is quite a bit larger, but yet Japan has a population of 123 million versus the roughly 39 million in California, so far higher population density. And if we look at what is sometimes called effective population density, Japan is even more densely populated because about 85% of the country is mountainous and actually quite heavily forested. In that map on the left, the green areas are the lowlands, which is essentially where almost all the population, almost all the agriculture, and almost all the industry is located. So those areas are extremely crowded and have been for quite some time. The map on the right shows the situation of Japan in 1664, but the crucial date here is around 1600 when feudal Japan was essentially unified, or at least partially unified. It was unified under what is called the Tokugawa shogunate, as shogun was a military leader who had effective power. And the Tokugawa lands are only those in yellow on the map. So the Tokugawa only directly administered those areas. The other areas were under the power of local daimyo, lords essentially, but the Tokugawa government was powerful enough to dominate all of those and effectively unite Japan. One thing that meant was essentially the end of war, and Japan had about a 250-year period of peace and security, and starting out with relative prosperity. And during this period, the population grew significantly. The previous century was one of a lot of chaos, civil wars, feudal government, whatever you want to call it. But after unification under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had this period of very pronounced population growth, reaching a position where it was really quite overcrowded by many ways of looking at it. And then there was this period of population stabilization, which was largely due to people controlling their birth rate and basically limiting it to roughly the replacement level. The next series of slides I'm going to show you are quite different in style from the slides I usually show. That's because I borrowed them from my wife, Karen Wigan, who is a professor of Japanese history and the history of cartography at Stanford. So rather than make my own slides, well, I made a few, but I mostly just borrowed those from her. So you could see on the slide here from 1700 to 1850, the population of China doubled, or more than doubled, and I'll talk about that later on, as in Japan, it was essentially flat. Look at another graph here showing from about a 150-year period, roughly the same population. By today's standards, not nearly as densely populated, but considering the economy of the time, yes, very densely populated. One way to look at the population density of Japan, which put the country in considerable economic and ecological stress and tension, is to look at something as mundane as human waste. Human waste was of great value in traditional Japan, value as fertilizer. The photo on the left shows so-called night soil. This is basically human waste being carted out of cities into agricultural areas. One on the right shows a farmer carrying it out to the field. I mean, there are even stories of Japanese farmers visiting another family, and they would be regarded as very stingy and unneighborly if they would hold it in and relieve themselves at home to save that valuable resource, their excreta, if you will. And this is somewhat true in China as well. They had these extremely intensive agricultural systems, using everything they possibly could to maintain fertility, essentially because they had to, considering the density of the population. It also meant a diet with very low levels of protein. Certainly, the Japanese did a lot of fishing, but for the average person, poor people, protein was in pretty sparse supply. And the Japanese were, to a very large degree, sort of stunted in size in these earlier periods, probably due to a lack of protein. And one other thing to mention about this kind of agricultural system is it means that raw fruits or vegetables in particular are to be avoided because of the danger of contamination. Now, how did the Japanese control their fertility during this long period when they were basically at the replacement level? Well, a lot of it was through infanticide, not entirely. And I have the cover here of Fabian Drixler's rather remarkable book on infanticide population growth in eastern Japan. It's called Mabiki, and Mabiki means thinning out, as in thinning out seedlings, for example. But this was of thinning out children. The cover illustration is really quite striking. You have a woman basically smothering her baby, putting pillows on its chest and then compressing it. And the grandparents, grandmother and grandfathers, are fighting over whether to let this happen, and the husband is sort of standing above them all. So in this Edo area, that's another term for the Tokugawa period. Edo was the term that Tokyo was known as. But the family planning involved what Malthus called preventative checks, such as late marriage, people having to wait until they have some sort of property endowment to be able to marry. Long periods of marital separation, often the husband or the wife would have to go work as a servant, for example, in wealthier families. Prolonged breastfeeding to 4 or 5 years old, which reduces fertility, and then infanticide. And there are, I'm sure, various means of performing abortion or contraception as well. This can be seen in a lot of documents from the time. Japan has extremely good demographic records. Japan and Sweden are the two countries that have the sort of the deepest run of demographic data. It's interesting, in Japan, one reason why it's so rich is when the Tokugawa came to power a few decades later, they essentially outlawed Christianity, which had been spreading under Portuguese auspices in the 16th century. A lot of Christians were slaughtered. There was also this intense effort to wipe out the religion. And one way they did this was to make people register births and deaths and marriages at a Buddhist temple. And so here's a document from a Buddhist temple. So the Japanese, in this period, in the 18th century, generally had small families characterized by late starting, fairly relatively old parents, stopping fairly early, spacing out their births, usually around 5 years or so. And unlike in China, often seeking sex parity. In China, you had a situation with a lot of female infanticide, in the 20th century, selective abortion of girls, because of the intense desire to be able to carry out the family line through sons and grandsons and so on, so that the ancestors can be honored. Japan had a lot of the same thing, but they had a way of avoiding this problem in that a son-in-law could be adopted, so your family line can go through your daughter and her husband. It doesn't have to be traced simply through the patriline or the male line. Mabiki, we have a photo of somebody here thinning out rice seedlings, but it was often this infanticide was done to space children, want this fairly large gap, and to have the desired sex. And the general one was to have a girl first. The idea being that when you have a boy, maybe 5 years later or so, the girl child is going to be old enough to help rear that, her brother. and then to have a target desired family size, to have replacement level fertility in this kind of an environment with a high, relatively high death rate. Would have had to have, I don't know the exact number, but well over two, probably over three. And overall, for Japanese society, those numbers were maintained. There was, however, a lot of internal differentiation in Japan, and this is one of the things that Fabian Drixler looks at in his book. So you can see the dark areas there had a reputation for a lot of infanticide, and the white areas had a reputation for abhorring infanticide. So it was different from place to place. And those white areas tend to be on the Japan Sea side, or the western side of the country. This is some important areas here for rice cultivation, mining, and other sorts of things. So it was not a backwater of Japan at this time. It would later become something of the backside of Japan, but it really wasn't in this period. But this sort of begs the question of why in some regions of Japan was there a reputation for lots of infanticide and others for much less infanticide and for at least many people finding it just an abhorrent practice. And the answer is in religion. It's in particular sects of Buddhism. So Japan has many different, half a dozen or a dozen, I don't know the exact number, different sects of Buddhism, which are quite distinctive. In the United States, Zen Buddhism is by far the best known. In the Tokugawa period, Zen was mostly the faith of the elite samurai class, the warrior-turned-elite bureaucrat class, if you will. Zen Buddhism is very demanding, very rigorous spiritual practices are done in the quest to reach nirvana, or when you die, to have sort of divine union with the cosmos, however you want to think about it. But there were many other sects, and the sect that in particular abhorred infanticide was Pure Land Buddhism. So Pure Land Buddhism, very popular, and this map shows a much later time period, 1922, but if you look at areas where you have a high percentage of people adhering to Pure Land Buddhism, it's precisely those areas that had a reputation for abhorring Buddhism. So, I'm sorry, abhorring infanticide, Mabiki. So Pure Land Buddhism was much less difficult spiritual practices. The most important thing was to chant the name of the Bodhisattva of compassion. So a Bodhisattva in Buddhism is a spiritual entity who by purpose does not undergo nirvana or union with the ultimate, but instead remains an active supernatural entity helping living human beings. So Amida, the Bodhisattva of compassion, in Pure Land Buddhism, one is supposed to pray to Amida, and especially near the moment of death, invoke the name of Amida, and then through, well, what we might call grace and a Christian compassion anyway, the person would be reborn in the Western paradise, which is the Western heaven, as you might call it. But it was much more of, a lot closer, interesting, sort of much greater similarities with Christianity than Zen Buddhism had, with this focus on compassion, and that led to abhorrence to acts that were seen as the antithesis of compassion, such as infanticide. And here you can see here a campaign that was launched by Pure Land Buddhism throughout the country in the early 1800s to try to stop this, what they regarded as an abhorrent practice. So there are a lot of tracts that were published, woodblock prints that then were published and distributed widely. And here we have text and we have some images, but let me focus in on that image on that, because it's not, symbolism isn't subtle. You have a mother killing her baby, although it looks like a child, not a baby, but a much older child, very large. That to signalize the importance, and the mother is essentially turned into a demon. And then after death, the baby goes directly to the Western heaven and becomes a bodhisattva. Not at all a subtle symbolism. So anyway, by the mid-1800s, this campaign has essentially worked. It partly works because it gets picked up by the government. The government is interested by this time by the mid 1800s in increasing the birth rate. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but you can see the population really starts to decline. And the government had a lot of power. There was a lot of surveillance of families, subsidies were given out, and so on. Interesting, though, right about the time that the population begins to grow, there's a great famine, the Tempo famine, some series of cold summers, and I think it was especially marked in that northern area of Japan where infanticide had been so common with a lot of deaths. But anyway, by the late 1800s, late 19th century, Japan underwent the Meiji Restoration, which meant the Tokugawa government was gone. Instead, you had a much more centralized government and a government that is very aggressively modernizing, adopting policies from Europe and from the United States, industrializing and expanding, becoming an imperial power in its own right. The Japanese had concluded the only way they could withstand Western imperialism was to become imperialistic themselves. The northern island of Hokkaido, a very large island, a crucial part of Japan, really wasn't part of Japan earlier. There were Japanese people in the far southern part of it. Most of it was occupied by Ainu people, a very, very different population, different language, different culture, and so on. But it was annexed right about the time when Japan opened up to the outside world and started this modernization campaign. And then eventually the Japanese in 1895 took over Taiwan, in 1910 Korea, took over Manchuria in China in 1931, and the government at this time wants a larger population to send out administrators and settlers into these other regions to help make Japan a great power in the world, which obviously came to a fast end at the termination of World War II. It's interesting to look at more recently at Japan's total fertility rate ups and downs. So we could see here starting in 1800, fertility rate increasing. That's with these anti-infanticide campaigns of Pure Land Buddhism, and then kind of evening out in the Tempo famine, but then increasing again. And then with the Meiji transition and modernization, first you get a downturn. This is a turbulent time, and in turbulent times, often the birth rate will go down. But then once the country is stabilized and beginning to grow and modernize and industrialize and expand, you see a sharp increase in the birth rate. You could see with the Depression of World War II another decrease, and then a bit of a baby boom after World War II. It drops, and then you can see it pushes up again a little bit in the 1970s with Japan's economic miracle, and then when that comes to an end, dropping again. One really interesting thing to note about Japan's total fertility rate historically is it is influenced by this 60-year cycle. It's a cycle of years. You find it across East Asia, in China and Korea as well, where you have that's sometimes called the Chinese zodiac, but it's quite different. But you have the year of the of different animals on a 12-year cycle, and then there's another one, and they correspond every 60 years. So you can see 1966, that just this striking plunge in the fertility rate just for 1 year, and then back up again. That's because 66 was a fire horse year. And a common belief was that a woman born in the year of the fire horse would have a strong temperament and would shorten her husband's life. 2026 will be another fire horse year, so it'll be interesting to see if this belief is still powerful enough to have an impact in fertility patterns. So I'm going to move on to China now. This map is a somewhat hypothetical map showing population density in the year 1800. And it's important just to note how dense China, particularly the North China Plain, you can also see the Sichuan Basin as well as coastal areas with this very dense population, much denser than anything in Europe. The Ganges River Valley in India and some of the coastal areas similar. You can see Europe densely populated compared to the rest of the world, but not compared to Eastern China, Japan. It's kind of hard to see Japan there, or even Korea. So let's anyway look at China. China, if you remember from previous lectures, was very chaotic in the mid 17th century, mid 1600s. There were problems with climate, the depths of the Little Ice Age, perhaps a Malthusian crisis, some would say. But anyway, what was more striking was the fall of the Ming government, replaced by the Manchus, who were not Chinese, but who became the ruling dynasty from 1644 all the way up to 1910, 1911. And it took a while for the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty to really cement their rule. But by 1700, they certainly had done it, and across the span of the next century, say from 1700 to early 1800s, maybe 1820 or so, China was extremely prosperous, stable. A number of very capable emperors who were long-lived. China was expansionistic at this time, conquered a lot of territories in Central Asia, what is now Xinjiang, for example. And it was the most populous and most economically productive state in the world through the 18th century. And during this time, its population surged from about 1700 to 1825. And then it plateaued, and then it declined after that. By the time you get to 1820 or so, you're entering China's period of century of humiliations, as it's sometimes called. And then you can see really grows again in the modern era after World War II. I'll talk about that later on. So just one thing really important to note about China is how unevenly distributed the population is. So Western China, Tibet, Xinjiang, most of Inner Mongolia, is either very dry or very mountainous, very high elevation, not suitable for large-scale agriculture. I mean, there's some intensively cultivated oasis zones, and you could see some yellow and red areas in the far northwest. But the distinction between eastern and western China is stark. And you can pick out particular areas like the North China Plain, the Yangtze Valley, the Sichuan Basin, the South Coastal region with these very dense population. So as mentioned before, from 1700 to 1820, China under the rule of the Qing dynasty of the Manchu people was very strong, stable, and prosperous. This shows the core regions of China, what is sometimes called China proper in dark yellow. And light yellow are areas that were traditionally mostly occupied by non-Chinese peoples, although that will eventually change in many areas because of Chinese migration. But they were administered somewhat differently. And then the orange areas are independent countries that acknowledge the supremacy of China and sent tribute missions to China. Now, those tribute missions, then the government of China would send gifts to those rulers. So it was really often seen as sort of a managed form of trade rather than tribute per se. But those states did have to acknowledge the supremacy of China. So Korea did this most famously. If you look at this intensive population growth in the 1700s in China, there are a variety of different factors. I thought it would be an interesting experiment to see what ChatGPT, what AI would say, and that what this chatbot focused on at first was agricultural innovations. Well, I think it's probably relatively accurate, like new crops, and I'll talk about those. Better irrigation and land management. So the Qing dynasty was very active in this, and generally when Chinese dynasties were in their stronger periods, they put a lot of effort into infrastructure, canals, irrigation, diking to prevent flooding. And then when they weakened, often there was a neglect of these sort of things, which could lead to major crises. Double cropping, well, in South China, well, throughout Eastern China, double cropping had been done for long periods of time, but agriculture is becoming more intense. And subsequent lectures, I'll talk more about agricultural intensification. What they didn't mention in the ChatGPT was the introduction of fast maturing rice strains from Southeast Asia that would permit 2 harvests of rice. In some areas in the far south, even 3 in 1 year. So it was a hyper-intensive cultivation. As was true in Europe, the Columbian Exchange greatly benefited China. This is a French map It's pretty easy to understand what they're showing. It's well worth examining in some detail. But you could see the movement of crops from the Americas, South America, Central America, Mesoamerica in particular, and you could see large arrows going from South America and Central Mexico, Mesoamerica, to China. Uh, Actually, most of this went through, not directly to China, but through the Philippines. The Philippines had become a Spanish colony basically for trade with China. Uh, China had a huge demand for silver. It had, like I said, the largest economy in the world, and it was there had been experiments with paper currency under the Mongols, but those ended up with hyperinflation. So China wanted a strong, stable currency based on silver. They had copper coins as well, but silver was the most important. But virtually no silver in China, so it was imported first from Japan and then later mostly from Peru and Bolivia and Mexico, which had the largest silver mines in the world by far in the early modern period. But the Spaniards established what were known as the Manila galleons, where they would take treasure fleets with tremendous amount of silver from Acapulco, Mexico to Manila, and there they would trade it with China. In return, they'd get silk, porcelain, other Chinese goods, bring that back to Mexico, and then a lot of that would cross the Atlantic and go to Spain. So that's generally how these crops came into China. The most important is probably the sweet potato. This map, not a map I made, but when I borrowed, you could see sweet potato coming from, was probably domesticated in northern South America. It comes to the Philippines. It doesn't show an arrow going up to China. It's funny, it does show an arrow going across the Himalayan mountains into Tibet. I put an X across that because that did not happen. Where a lot of these changes were most important is in southern China. Southern China has and has long had very densely populated lowland basins dominated by irrigated rice cultivation, but then a lot of uplands, a lot of mountainous, hilly regions. And so this map is a pretty good physical map of Guangdong province in far southern China, southeastern China. I pointed out Hong Kong and Macau. I also have I wrote population core area. That's around the city of Guangzhou, Pearl River Delta, as it's sometimes called. Very flat, very fertile, intensively cultivated, a lot of triple cropping here. But a lot of those uplands were pretty sparsely cultivated. A lot of them had been intensively deforested. And in some places, people had made rice terraces, but mostly it was sort of rough land. Produced some fertilizers. One reason why it's so deforested, there were episodes of continuing practice of burning trees and shrubs for the ash, for fertilizer for the fields, which resulted in a lot of deforestation. Anyway, these upland crops coming from the Americas, sweet potatoes more important than anything else, but also maize or corn and peanuts, played a huge role in allowing people to productively farm these hilly upland areas. I should mention something about the sweet potato. The plant is described by botanists as a very efficient nutrient forager. So even relatively poor soils, sweet potatoes can usually give a pretty substantial harvest. They need a long growing season, but you certainly have that in southern China, which is subtropical or even far enough south, tropical zone. The Hakka people were the ethnic group that really took up this way of life. So the Hakka have their own dialect, essentially a language, but they're usually considered part of the Han Chinese majority group. 94% of Chinese are Han. They don't all speak the same dialect, or what linguists would say same language, because the different dialects are not mutually intelligible, or at least the main ones. Hakka were sometimes, though, were excluded from this Han category, even though they really fit in it, partly because they were often despised by other people, regarded as sort of aggressive peoples who had pushed into these upland areas and made them productive. So often looked down by other ethnic groups. When China really started to collapse after the Opium War in the mid-1800s, a lot of these areas became very chaotic with very little security. And it's interesting, the Hakka adopted these sort of highly fortified villages, really. So these earth buildings, rammed earth architecture, up to 5 stories tall, often in a square or circular pattern, holding many, many families. And that was sort of characteristic of a situation of low security. And you can see it's an upland environment. You can see some banana plants there showing the tropical or subtropical climate, some terracing as well that's been conducted. There have been some very strong claims about the Hakka people. An interesting article here that I've quoted here claiming that China's modern transformation is the epic story of the Hakka 16 centuries of sojourning through China, bringing forth unique ideas and institutions, and have been engaged in a lot of revolutionary activities, beginning with something called the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hakka. Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement in the early 20th century. A lot of Hakka leaders. Mao Zedong was not Hakka, but a lot of the communists were. So a lot of Hakka moved into revolutionary or politics, partly because they had been under such pressure from other ethnic groups. Occupying these rough lands, difficult to make a living with. A lot of Hakka moved to Southeast Asia, and it's interesting, a lot of Southeast Asian leaders are of Hakka background. Lee Kuan Yew, the modern founder of Singapore, former Prime Minister of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, former leader of Thailand, Thaksin Shinawatra. That's a Thai name, but his I believe it was his father was Hakka. Many Chinese in Thailand adopted Thai names. Shinawatra was well, he is still around, but anyway, he was a telecoms billionaire who became a populist ruler of Thailand until he was sort of expelled in a series of anti-populist movements. But anyway, there were other factors in this 18th century population boom in China, as was the case in Europe. Smallpox inoculation probably began in China. As in Europe, 18th century had relatively few epidemic diseases. Smallpox was essentially under control. Chinese traditional medicine was pretty advanced in its own way, and there's been discussion of improved birthing techniques by midwives and doctors, reducing infant and maternal mortality. Also, as in Japan, there were government campaigns against infanticide, not as successful in China, probably, at least for female infanticide. And when the Qing Empire was very strong, as was true of other strong dynasties in China, there was a lot of attention to government granaries so that rice is stored in the case of shortages. And also, as was true in Europe, improved transportation networks, canals, and roads, and so on. This good period in China, though, came to an end. End date you could put in various different times. Rebellions started breaking out very early in the 1800s. One crucial date, though, would be 1839, which was the beginning of the First Opium War, where the British were very actively engaged in trade in China, mostly seeking tea, but they also wanted the silks and the porcelains and these other high-quality Chinese goods, but there was this huge tea trade. China didn't really want anything Britain produced. They just wanted silver. According to the old mercantilist model of economics, the government, the state should not be hemorrhaging its supply of precious metals to other countries. The British East India Company that was doing this trade finally, by the 1820s or so, figured out how to maintain a more positive trade balance, which is by exporting opium, which was cultivated in British India and then sent to China. And as China started to weaken, and you might even think of it as a Malthusian crisis, with its population just having built up to its limit, resulting in intense poverty, and then a lot of social dislocation and sort of people losing faith and misery, and opium addiction often goes hand in glove with that. So this was the beginning of what's often called a century of humiliation, lasting from the First Opium War, 1839, to the end of World War II. And lots of debates over whether this can be viewed as a Malthusian crisis, just too many people for the resources. Certainly, the actions of the Western imperial powers, including the United States, was very important as well in ending Chinese prosperity and beginning this long period of deep misery. Of course, a lot of wealthy people in China remain prosperous, but not so the people at large. Here you have another French map that's showing a variety of things. It's showing territorial losses of China, losses to Russia in particular. It's showing some information on the Opium War. One thing I do want to mention about the Opium War was by this time, European military technology was really racing ahead. In the 18th century, there is no way any European power could have made any headway against China. China was simply too strong and powerful, and in military terms, it may not have been exactly up to European standards, but wasn't too far behind. But by the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution is totally changing this. And on the right, you have an illustration of a ship called Nemesis. It's a steamship, one of the earliest ironclad steam warships, still has sails, but it had a low draft, only about 6 feet, powerful gun batteries. And this one ship could take out any of the coastal defenses. They had coastal forts with cannons, but they could be destroyed by this. And that ship could, because of its low draft, could go up the rivers, which were the arteries of transportation and communication in China, and pretty much do what it wanted. And so the Chinese had to basically sue for peace and open up a number of ports for European trade and give over Hong Kong to the British. I won't go into other details about this, but things go from bad to worse. Starting in 1850, you have the Taiping Rebellion, led by a Hakka leader, sort of a millenarian movement to try to kick out the Manchu Qing dynasty and to religious overtones, actually combining traditional Chinese beliefs and some Christian beliefs. But the Taiping Rebellion was a close-fought thing. The Taiping rebels had control. You can see areas in this map at different time periods. But the lower Yangtze Valley and then up the river, this was the core of China, the economic, not the political core so much, but certainly the economic core, the cultural core as well. Quite densely populated, but the sort of the leading economic zone. Anyway, this very long-lasting rebellion finally crushed, resulted in maybe 20, 30 million. Some scholars would even say more like 40 million deaths. So here you then can see this in this population chart with China's population declining significantly. So it had this sharp rise in the 1700s, sort of then a plateau, early 1800s, maybe they had reached sort of the limits, and then the disasters of the mid-century and a population decline. Eventually it's going to start to grow again. There are huge debates about Malthusian demography in China. I have a book title here, James Lee and Wang Feng, One Quarter of Humanity, which is arguing against Malthusian interpretations. So the text I've highlighted here, their work overturns much of the received wisdom about the differences between China and the West, first voiced by Malthus. So I'll talk about Malthus later on. He certainly saw China as a country that didn't have the kind of restrictions on early marriages and high levels of celibacy that was associated with Western Europe. China was sort of has been viewed as a society with near universal marriage. There were certainly some Buddhist monks, but the Buddhist monasteries had essentially been crushed by previous Chinese dynasties, and they didn't really have much authority or power in China. So you didn't have much of this sort of clerical celibacy, as was true in Europe, and you did have these early marriages. But anyway, to get back to the blurb for this book, Malthus described a China in which early and universal marriage ensured high fertility and therefore high mortality in the Malthusian sense, which he contrasted with Western Europe, where marriage often occurred late and was far from universal, resulting in lower fertility and higher demographic responsiveness to negative economic circumstances. And Malthus argued that this continued high fertility in China resulted in mass misery. But James Lee and Wang Feng argue instead that there had been effective regulation of population growth in China. Well, on that population graph, we did see periods of the population plateauing. Early 1800s, it had sort of plateaued out. And it was through a variety of practices that reduced marital fertility, in some cases below European standards. And a lot of this was from infanticide, as in Japan. Probably a lot was through various means of contraception and sexual practices to reduce fertility. Um, anyway, these two authors talk about four distinctive features of the Chinese demographic pattern: high rates of female infanticide, especially low rates of male marriage. Well, because the sex ratio was so skewed, so many more men than women, a lot of men are not able to marry. And somewhat low rates of marital fertility, also high rates of adoption. So they said this was a sort of a demographic transition to reduced fertility that was different from the one that took place in the West. Now, obviously, that China's population surged again in the 20th century. I'll talk about that later on. But this debate continues. So here's information from a book review about this book, where the author brings up alternative explanations. So the most contentious point in this book about Malthus in China was that Chinese couples had deliberately controlled their fertility. Arthur Wolff, an anthropologist formerly associated with Stanford, a defender of the received view, thinks that Li and Wang and their fellow travelers are mistaken. To quote, the revisionists are right in insisting that marital fertility was lower in China than in some parts of Europe. The reason, they say, the reason that Li and Wang said was birth control. The reason Wolff says is poverty. Wolff argues that the Chinese women bore 7 or 8 children rather than 10 or 11, which is found in some parts of Europe. Not evidence of birth control, but rather of chronic malnutrition, untreated diseases, hard manual labor, economically enforced conjugal separation. Clearly, we have not heard the last words. That's maybe the best place to end it, but I do have 3 more slides, so I'll go ahead with them. And I have talked about this great divergence debate in the book, The Great Divergence by Kenneth Pomerantz. Pomerantz argues that China and Europe were basically on a par economically, technologically, in terms of living standard until around 1820, and that's when the divergence began, coincidentally about the same time that the Europeans started plundering China and taking power in that country. Pomerantz thinks that environmental factors played a big role in this divergence, particularly Europe was blessed with deposits of coal located in convenient places that allowed them to move away from using wood for fuel and not have the kind of environmental degradation that comes from an economy based on having to use wood. It's a hotly debated book. One of the real important points Pomerantz makes is that when you compare China to, let's say, make a comparison of China and England in the mid-1700s, authors would say, well, the English were far better off than the Chinese. But Pomerantz would say that's not a valid comparison because China's orders of magnitude larger. What you need to do would be to, say, compare England with the Yangtze Delta area, which was the most prosperous part of China. And he said there the differences are not nearly as great. At Stanford, professor of Chinese history Matt Summer, who I know quite well, has argued or does argue against Pomerantz's interpretation. Matt Summers is a legal historian, and he has looked at a lot of cases of, one of his books is called Polyandry and Wife Selling in Qing Dynasty China. Polyandry is a form of polygamy, unlike polygyny, where one man has multiple wives, and polyandry, one woman has multiple husbands. And looking through these legal records from Sichuan Basin in China, what Summer sees is just intense poverty, forcing people to do things that they, well, wouldn't really want to do. So just to read from this description of the book, he writes about sexual survival strategies of the rural poor under conditions of overpopulation, worsening sex ratios, too many men, not enough women, and shrinking farm sizes, which you get with growing population. Polyandry and wife selling represent opposite ends of the spectrum of strategies. At one end, polyandry was a means to keep the family together by expanding it. A woman would bring in a second husband, a man who couldn't otherwise marry, in exchange for his help in supporting her family. In contrast, wife sale was a means of survival by breaking up the family. During famine periods, for example, where sometimes the alternative might be starvation, but a man would literally sell his wife to a more prosperous man to ensure survival. Husband would secure emergency infusion of cash. His wife's needs would be net. His wife would escape poverty and secure a fresh start with another man, although not anything but equality in that situation, which really goes without saying. Anyway, to continue with the information here, even though Qing law prohibited both practices under the rubric illicit sexual relations, Summers shows how magistrates charged with propagating, enforcing fundamentalist Confucian vision of female chastity tried to cope with the realities of people in the face of just daunting poverty. So a lot of this depends on what part of China you're looking at, in what period you're looking at. But it does seem true that in many parts of China, by the 1800s, many places were just suffering from intense poverty, resulting from what is hard to describe as anything other than overpopulation. Now, it wasn't true to the same extent elsewhere in China. So anyway, the debate continues, and I don't want to come down too strongly on one side. I find it a very productive debate and interesting to look at these different interpretations. And then finally, as a last slide, China still has a male-biased population. Infanticide is not so much an issue today, but sex-selective abortion is, although it's not as extreme as it was 20 years ago. But there are more men than women in the Chinese population. Many countries, though, have an even more male-biased population. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries really stand out on here, partly because there's so much labor immigration of men more than of women into those oil-based economies. But you could see that India also even more, more male-based population. Where the countries in red, you can see larger female population, and it's interesting how Russia really stands out on that. I hope to have time to talk about some of the sex ratio issues in later lectures. We'll see how much time is left. At any rate, thanks for tuning in. The next lecture I'm going to give will probably look at depopulation in Africa due to the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade, which resulted in a certain amount of repopulation of the Americas. And then the lecture after that will turn in a more theoretical way, and we'll look at the works of Malthus. I've talked a lot about Malthus and Malthusianism, but haven't really gone into detail. And I'll also look at some alternatives to Malthusianism, particularly the work of the Danish agricultural economist Esther Bosserup on agricultural intensification. So I hope you can tune into those, and hope you enjoyed this lecture.